You've been taught that the world around you is solid, measurable, and concrete. That the eyes perceive truth, the hands touch certainty, and the mind interprets facts. But what if all of it, everything you see, hear, and feel, is nothing more than a filtered projection? Not fiction, not fantasy, but a designed perception. A framework so convincingly structured you rarely stop to ask who built it or why. The walls you believe are unshakable may be nothing more than translucent illusions. Your thoughts, your sensations, your beliefs, are they truly yours, or simply echoes of a system programmed to keep you confined within a tightly controlled spectrum of awareness? For thousands of years, mystics and philosophers whispered that reality is not what it appears to be. That behind every sound and shadow lies a hidden scaffolding, a matrix of codes and currents shaping your experience from behind the veil. Today, modern science begins to echo what ancient traditions have always asserted. Reality may be constructed, not discovered. But here's the question. If reality is a construct, then who or what is doing the constructing? And more importantly, how can you reclaim your perception from it? In this video, we aren't here to entertain speculative philosophy. We're here to explore practical truths, ideas that challenge the normal, confront the assumed, and peel back layers of illusion. You'll be presented with insights that connect ancient metaphysics with cutting-edge science, Gnostic mysteries with quantum mechanics, and long-buried wisdom with your own capacity to awaken. By the end, you'll no longer see the world the same way. You'll recognize the distortions in perception, the glitches in the code, and the subtle mechanics that shape your consciousness. More than that, you'll discover tools to break the hypnosis, to step beyond the programmed narrative and see with clarity, not just eyes. This isn't a spiritual fairy tale or abstract theory. It's a guide for mental sovereignty. Because once you awaken to the coded nature of your reality, you can start rewriting the script you've unknowingly been following your entire life. Welcome to the unveiling. Let's begin. Everything you've ever experienced has passed through a filter first: your nervous system, eyes, ears, skin, tongue, nose. All of these are merely input tools. They translate a fraction of the external world into signals your brain can interpret. But the staggering truth is this: your senses register only a sliver of what's really out there. Your eyes detect less than 1% of the electromagnetic spectrum. That means over 99% of potential reality is simply invisible to you. Your ears register only a narrow frequency range of sound. Even your brain, supposedly the grand processor of truth, can only process information that fits within the parameters it's been conditioned to recognize. What's outside those parameters? It's either ignored or labeled as anomaly, hallucination, or error. So, let's ask the critical question. Is reality limited, or are you? This is where the architecture of perception reveals itself. From birth, you're taught to trust your senses implicitly. Yet, those senses are merely translating and often distorting information based on pre-installed programs. Color is not color, its wavelengths interpreted. Sound is not sound, its vibration interpreted. Time is not a flowing river, it's a construct perceived through patterned neural cycles. You experience a version of reality shaped entirely by interpretation, not by essence. Now pause. Who benefits from this arrangement? If your senses are programmable, then so is your reality. And history has shown time and again, when perception can be shaped, behavior can be controlled. The human mind becomes pliable not through chains, but through frames. Frames of what's considered real, acceptable, or even possible. Systems are built around reinforcing those frames. Institutions, education, entertainment, all subtly instruct you where to look and where not to. They create boundaries in thought before you even question the territory. The result? A society of individuals who operate inside an invisible cage, convinced they are free simply because the bars are transparent. But here's the deeper layer. Not only are your senses filtered, but your consciousness itself is layered with defaults. Default settings in attention, belief, reaction, and expectation. These settings are not accidental. They are inherited, installed, and reinforced repeatedly until they become indistinguishable from your identity. The veil isn't just around you, it's within you. Language is another tool that cements perception. Words shape your cognition. You don't just describe reality with language, you perceive it through it. Language creates categories, boxes, definitions. But those very definitions can become limitations. Words like real, truth, logic, and fact carry immense authority, but they also subtly dictate what you're allowed to experience. The question now arises: how do you escape a perceptual prison you cannot see? It begins with the awareness that the prison exists. Most never reach this stage. They remain inside the construct, content with borrowed beliefs and filtered senses. But once the suspicion arises, once the curtain flickers, the unraveling begins. You start questioning not just what you believe, but how those beliefs were formed in the first place. The veil is clever. It doesn't simply block reality, it replaces it. It offers a surrogate so convincing, most accept it without hesitation. And the most dangerous part? It rewards compliance. It provides comfort for staying asleep and discomfort for waking up. That's why awakening is not just awareness, it's rebellion. A rebellion against illusion, programming, and the counterfeit consensus that masquerades as truth. Now consider this: if your reality is filtered and constructed, then so is your identity. Who you believe you are is a product of mirrored perceptions, from family, culture, religion, media, education. You inherited a personality shaped by external scripts. But the self that watches this, the awareness behind the narrative, has always been untouched. That watcher is not the character. It's the one observing the character. And this is the fracture point where awakening begins. When you stop identifying with the puppet strings and start recognizing the observer, you begin to exit the construct. But be warned, this path isn't linear. Awakening doesn't come through comfort. It comes through the tension of realizing everything you've called reality might have been theater, staged by sensory illusions and mental conditioning. The veil of perception is seductive. It offers you the illusion of control, the illusion of knowledge, the illusion of stability. But beneath that comfort is a deeper calling, the call to see the unseen, to hear the silence, to remember what your conditioned mind was trained to forget. And that's why this isn't just philosophical discussion. It's a challenge to break your perceptual habits, to sharpen your awareness beyond the normal bandwidth, and to stop accepting default reality as ultimate truth. You are not merely a spectator in a world of objects. You are a node of consciousness immersed in an intelligent field of patterns, codes, and frequencies. The world doesn't simply happen to you, it happens through you. This is the veil, not a curtain in front of your eyes, but a web inside your mind. And the moment you begin to see its threads, the unraveling starts. The question is no longer what is real, but what have I accepted as real without ever questioning it? The answers may disturb you, but the freedom they unlock will change everything. There's a strange pattern buried in the writings of those who've looked behind the curtain. They speak in symbols, in layered metaphors, in complex webs of thought that resist surface understanding. One such figure, often misunderstood and quietly revered in obscure circles, is Thomas Pynchon. Known for his literary cryptography and refusal to be seen, he represents far more than a novelist. His work isn't just fiction. It's a warning, a map, a coded manual pointing toward the structures hiding in plain sight. What makes Pynchon's writing so unsettling isn't the complexity of language or narrative. It's his obsession with unseen systems, grids of control, networks of influence, silent operators embedded in everyday life. His characters often wander in a distorted reality, unaware they're surrounded by invisible mechanisms, patterns, conspiracies, coincidences. He strings them together not to confuse, but to illuminate the strange architecture beneath ordinary experience. And this isn't just literary flair. It reflects an archetype repeated throughout human thought. The idea that reality, as it appears, is only a surface, a mask for deeper layers governed by hidden laws. The ancients knew this intimately. In every culture, beneath myths and rituals, they encoded structural truths. They didn't describe reality as fixed and objective. They portrayed it as symbolic, energetic, alive. Their cosmologies weren't just spiritual beliefs. They were models of perception, maps for navigating consciousness, not just planets. Consider the concept of sacred geometry. To modern science, geometry is mathematical. To ancient minds, geometry was the signature of consciousness embedded in form. Circles, spirals, fractals, these were not just patterns of nature but expressions of universal intelligence. The same spiral found in galaxies mirrors the spiral in your DNA. These weren't coincidences. They were keys, reminders that form is not random, but governed by deeper code. Now contrast this with what's emerging from the front lines of modern physics. At the quantum level, matter is no longer solid. It's probabilistic, uncertain, relational. Nothing exists in isolation. Particles respond to observation, space bends, time wavers. Reality begins to look less like a machine and more like a thought, less like a substance and more like a script. And suddenly, the gap between ancient mysticism and modern science begins to collapse. What Pynchon symbolized through characters wandering lost in manipulated systems is echoed in quantum experiments showing that reality behaves differently when it's observed. The observer is not separate from the observed. The experimenter changes the experiment. The division between mind and matter is no longer absolute. In ancient texts, this same concept takes another shape. The mind is portrayed as the projector of the world, not a passive receiver but an active architect. Consciousness shapes the field, just as science now discovers perception influences wavefunction collapse. When Pynchon crafts plots around paranoia, secret organizations, and elusive meanings, he's not merely describing fiction. He's reflecting the disorientation that arises when the hidden infrastructure of reality starts to be noticed. That moment of unease when pattern becomes too precise, when coincidence becomes signal, when randomness reveals symmetry, that's the shift from surface thinking to structural awareness. Throughout history, thinkers have mirrored this. Plato's allegory wasn't just about shadows on the cave wall. It was about perception filtered through layers of illusion. The shadows weren't lies. They were incomplete truths. The light behind them was real, but only to the one who questioned the entire apparatus. Fast forward through time, Kant proposes that reality is filtered through innate structures of cognition. Schopenhauer sees the world as representation. Nietzsche breaks the spell of absolute truth and points to narrative as a force that shapes perception more than objectivity. Borges writes of infinite libraries and metaphysical labyrinths. Baudrillard warns of simulations replacing essence. And yet, these philosophical insights were already encoded long ago. Ancient traditions understood that the world we interact with is a mask layered over essence. The Sanskrit concept of Maya describes this veil, not illusion in the sense of falseness, but illusion in the sense of incompleteness. What you see is not the whole, it's the interface. Modern science now echoes this. Your senses detect data, but your brain constructs the image. Time feels linear, but physics tells us it's not. Space feels absolute, yet entangled particles mock that notion. Cause and effect begin to blur. Reality itself begins to look more like a simulation than a structure. Simulation. That word carries heavy modern implications. But even in ancient wisdom, the idea was present. Egyptian priests spoke of the world as a dream from which only a few could awaken. Tibetan texts describe reality as a projection of the subtle mind. Hermetic thinkers considered everything mental, nothing physical. Across continents and centuries, the message was the same. Form is not primary. Consciousness is. This is not metaphor anymore. Quantum computing, artificial intelligence, and frequency-based technologies now replicate principles that were once considered mystical. The boundaries between mysticism and mechanics are disintegrating. What was once poetic is now mathematical. What was once symbolic is now experimental. Think about the implications. If reality is influenced by thought, if perception changes matter, then everything changes. Identity, free will, belief all become mechanisms within a greater field of consciousness engineering. Suddenly, the self is not a fixed entity, it's a tuning device. Your beliefs are not just opinions, they are instruments that shape your field. The ancients knew this too. That's why they were obsessed with alignment of the body, of the stars, of inner energies. Because alignment wasn't spiritual fluff, it was access code. A way to harmonize with the underlying structure of the matrix you inhabit. This is where ancient wisdom meets science, not in conflict, but in synthesis. Pynchon's paranoia becomes clarity when viewed through this lens. His hidden systems aren't fantasies. They're metaphors for real mechanisms, networks of influence, perceptual traps, encoded systems of meaning. He didn't point to the systems to scare, but to awaken. Just like the sages of old didn't chant mantras to appease gods, but to modulate internal frequencies in resonance with a deeper order. The convergence is here. Physics now speaks of multidimensional fields. Mathematics describes holographic projections. Neuroscience acknowledges neuroplasticity as reality shaping. And consciousness is slowly being redefined, not as a side effect of biology, but as a prime force. So where does this lead you? It leads you to question how you interface with the world. Are you reacting to shadows on the wall? Or are you aware of the light source behind it? Are you living by inherited codes, or writing your own? The ancient and the modern are no longer opposite poles. They are mirrors reflecting the same truth from different angles. One through myth, the other through math. One through symbol, the other through system. But both pointing toward the same realization, that the universe is not a place you're trapped in, it's a medium you're shaping. And that realization changes everything. Because once you understand that you no longer move through life unconsciously, you no longer accept limitations without questioning the mechanism behind them. You begin to access forgotten potentials, refine your perception, and activate a deeper intelligence that isn't tied to your senses, but to your awareness itself. This is where the old meets the new, not in conflict, but in integration. A dialogue between ancients who saw beyond the veil and modern minds who now have the tools to decode it. The bridge has been built. All that remains is for you to walk it. There's a strange silence that echoes through the halls of modern science. It's not due to a lack of data or observation. It's a silence born of limitation. A boundary that still resists the sharpest instruments and the most refined theories. That silence surrounds one single question. A question so simple in wording, yet so impossible in resolution. What is consciousness? The more science advances, the clearer this mystery becomes. Not because it gets solved, but because it grows sharper in its refusal to be pinned down. Machines can calculate faster. Brain scans can highlight areas of neural activity. Behavioral psychology can predict reactions. But none of these can answer the question that refuses to fit into any equation. What is it like to experience? Not to compute, not to react, but to be. This is often called the hard problem of consciousness, and it stands apart from every other puzzle in neuroscience. You can dissect the brain endlessly, trace chemical signals, identify circuits, but still fail to explain how those processes result in the richness of awareness. The inner world, the sensation of self, the presence of mind that looks out from behind the eyes. Why does electrical activity in a neural network produce the color red, the feeling of nostalgia, the sense of awe? No theory answers that with precision. Every attempt eventually ends in a wall, where subjective experience defies objective measurement. That wall is not a failure of science. It's the shadow of something science alone was never designed to measure. And yet, this question is not new. It has echoed through philosophy, mysticism, and literature for thousands of years. Consciousness was never seen as a byproduct of matter. It was the origin point, the axis upon which reality turns. In this same atmosphere of mystery, Thomas Pynchon once again returns, not just as a writer, but as a symbolic figure. His sudden withdrawal from public life, his vanishing act, was not merely eccentricity. It was a metaphor for consciousness itself, present but elusive, active yet hidden, central to the narrative but beyond capture. His characters often stumble upon systems too vast to comprehend, grids of influence that shape their lives without their consent or understanding. And yet, it's not always the systems that are central, it's the character's perception of them. Their awareness shifts. They begin to see patterns where there was noise, structure where there was chaos. They awaken not because their environment changes, but because their perception does. This is not fiction anymore. This is the very nature of consciousness. It's not found by looking outward, but by noticing the act of noticing. It's not in the object, but in the awareness of the object. And in that awareness, a deeper truth begins to unfold. Consciousness is not in the brain, it surrounds the brain. It is not a byproduct, it's the field in which phenomena occur. Philosophers have echoed this for centuries. René Descartes proposed thought as the foundation of existence. Not the body, not the senses, but the inner witness. Spinoza saw mind and matter as two expressions of the same reality. Eastern traditions refined it further, not as thought alone, but as pure awareness, free of content, prior to emotion, prior even to identity. And now, strangely, science begins to bend in that direction. Researchers in quantum biology observe correlations between consciousness and the behavior of subatomic particles. Theories like integrated information theory attempt to map levels of awareness to complexity of systems. Yet even these struggle to cross the threshold from correlation to causation. The deeper you look into consciousness, the more it begins to resemble a mirror that reflects itself. A recursive loop that no algorithm can simulate. Because consciousness is not a function, it is a presence. It does not behave like matter, because it is not reducible to matter. And this realization leads to a quiet revolution, one that questions the foundation of perception itself. The ancient sages once said that the mind is not a container for thoughts, but a lens that shapes reality. Your experience is not passive, it is generated. Not by the external world alone, but by the interface between perception and the field of potential. This interface is what consciousness animates. Without it, the world exists, but remains unseen, unfelt, unrealized. In this light, the so-called hard problem becomes less a problem and more a misdirection. The real mystery is not how matter creates mind. The real mystery is how we came to believe that mind is subordinate to matter in the first place. That belief is a framework, a limitation. It blinds the thinker to deeper layers of truth. The moment you reverse the lens, everything shifts. Matter becomes expression, not cause. Reality becomes projection, not absolute. Your experience becomes a creative act, not a passive one. This is the threshold where Pynchon's narratives take on a new shape. His withdrawal is not just about privacy. It reflects an archetype of consciousness retreating from identification. A shift from form to awareness, from persona to presence. Just as his characters must decode the systems around them, so too must the conscious mind decode the system it resides in. That system is not physical. It is perceptual. It is composed not of walls and machines, but of assumptions and filters. Layers of belief that obscure the original clarity of presence. To pierce those filters, one must begin not with data, but with direct awareness. Not with answers, but with attention. Because consciousness is not found in thinking more, it is revealed in thinking less. In silence, in stillness, in the subtle noticing of the space between thoughts. This is why so many ancient traditions speak not in terms of acquiring knowledge, but in terms of awakening. The idea is not to add content to the mind, but to remove distortion from perception. Not to chase new ideas, but to refine the instrument of awareness. And once this process begins, everything starts to shift. You notice that thoughts are not you, they arise and pass. Emotions are not you, they flow and recede. Identity is not fixed, it is a mask shaped by memory and culture. But the one thing that never changes is awareness itself, the quiet witness, the unmoving center. That is the essence of consciousness. Not the content, but the capacity. Not the form, but the field. And that field cannot be found by dissection, it must be directly known. This realization does not come from science alone. Nor does it come from philosophy alone. It comes from experience. The kind that begins when you start questioning the very foundation of what it means to be aware. And when that questioning deepens, a new type of intelligence begins to emerge, an intelligence not based on information but on resonance. A clarity that doesn't speak in concepts, but in silence. A knowing that is not learned, but remembered. This is the frontier of consciousness. Not the next discovery in a lab, but the next discovery within your own awareness. Because that's where the mystery begins, and that's where it ends. The puzzle was never outside. It was always the lens through which you looked. There is a certain discomfort that arises when one begins to question the structure of reality. Not just the material arrangement of things, but the very framework that makes those things appear real in the first place. The deeper the inquiry goes, the more familiar concepts begin to unravel. Certainty erodes. Foundations begin to shift. And at some point, a provocative thought emerges. What if the world isn't simply misunderstood, but deliberately distorted? This idea wasn't born in modern philosophy. It wasn't sparked by quantum theory or psychological analysis. It was spoken of long ago in hidden traditions, whispered in ancient texts, preserved in fragments that survived suppression and erasure. Those teachings now carry a name that echoes through time, Gnosticism. But to treat it as a mere religious doctrine would miss the point entirely. It is not a belief system, it is a method of perception, a framework for decoding the illusion. In its essence, these teachings propose a staggering idea. The world as we know it is an imitation, a construct, not in the sense of a simulation created by machines, but in the sense of a perceptual overlay, an artifice designed to capture consciousness and hold it in limitation. This is not a metaphor. It is a direct confrontation with the assumption that reality is inherently truthful. Gnostic thought challenges that assumption and suggests that what most people call reality is a veil, not a window. At the core of this idea is the concept of manipulators, forces that influence thought, perception, and behavior not through visible means, but through subtle distortions. These forces were known as archons, not as mythological creatures, but as symbolic representations of influence, structures that shape reality from behind the scenes, not through overt force, but through invisible coding. These thought manipulators operate not in the physical realm, but in the perceptual layer, the realm of belief, identity, emotion, and programming. They do not need to dominate through violence. They dominate by directing perception, curating experience, and maintaining the illusion that what is seen is all that exists. The result is a world that appears solid but is held together by ideas. Ideas that were never yours to begin with. These teachings did not emerge in a vacuum. They were part of a larger movement of awakening, a network of seekers who recognized that something about this world was fundamentally inverted, that what was called light often served to blind, and what was called darkness often held keys to deeper understanding. It is no coincidence that these teachings were suppressed. Texts were burned, voices silenced. The custodians of institutional reality labeled such ideas as heretical, dangerous, subversive. Not because they were false, but because they threatened the structure that held the narrative in place. Truth that undermines control is always labeled dangerous. But the fragments remained, preserved through obscurity, hidden in symbols, encoded in metaphors, waiting for those with the eyes to see. And what they reveal is not an external mythology but an internal roadmap, a method of extracting awareness from artificial perception. The world, in this view, is a stage, not a poetic analogy, but a deliberate construction designed to evoke reaction, not revelation. Every part of it functions to keep consciousness engaged, distracted, and embedded in the story. The goal is not knowledge, but maintenance. The system does not evolve, it loops. It recycles attention, captures imagination, programs identity, and it does so by maintaining a false center, a surrogate truth that replaces direct knowing with imposed structure. That surrogate becomes law, tradition, social code, even morality. Not because those things are inherently flawed, but because they are shaped to reflect the artificial overlay, not the original awareness. The manipulators work by inverting the natural order. They place the outer above the inner, the image above the essence, the rule above the understanding. They glorify complexity to conceal simplicity. They reward distraction and punish introspection. They amplify division and suppress unity. They shape perception not by force but by saturation, flooding the mind with stimulus, repetition, and contradiction until the original signal of consciousness is drowned in noise. And so, most move through life guided by a map that was never drawn by their own awareness. They adopt thoughts not because they are true, but because they are familiar. They pursue goals not because they are meaningful, but because they are offered. They struggle with conflicts not because they are essential, but because they are embedded in the structure. This is not a flaw. It is the design, the architecture of Artifice. But here's the paradox. Even in a distorted system, awareness can break through, because the system can manipulate content, but it cannot touch pure awareness. It can shape thoughts, emotions, narratives, but it cannot rewrite the source of observation. That source remains untouched, even if forgotten. And that's the entry point. Once this is seen, the landscape begins to shift. What once appeared random now appears structured. What once appeared natural now appears encoded. And what once appeared as external pressure begins to reveal itself as internal programming. The manipulators do not need to control the outside world. They only need to implant their code in your perception. Once your lens is shaped, your reality shapes itself accordingly. The recovery of awareness requires a new form of inquiry, not directed at the content of experience, but at its origin. Not at the world, but at the mind's relationship with it. This is not philosophical speculation, it is practical awakening. That's why Gnostic teachings emphasized inner knowledge over external authority, direct knowing over inherited belief, clarity over conformity, not in rebellion but in precision. The aim was not to reject the world, but to reclaim perception. Not to escape life, but to see through the script that overlays it. This path requires attention, sharp, clear, unfiltered attention. Not passive observation, but active decoding. Every belief, every emotion, every perception must be examined not for its content, but for its origin. Who gave it to you? What shaped it? What maintains it? What purpose does it serve? You begin to notice patterns. Loops of thought that aren't yours, reactions that arise without conscious intent, identity scripts that play themselves automatically. And in that noticing, the first cracks appear in the surface of Artifice. Awareness begins to move through those cracks, not in sudden revelation, but in steady unraveling. You see the world not as it wants to appear, but as it is structured to appear. The symbols of manipulation become visible. The language of control becomes recognizable. And in that recognition, the power of the manipulators weakens. They do not fear rebellion, they fear perception. Because rebellion can be absorbed into the system. But perception breaks the system entirely. It renders it obsolete. That's why the ancient texts were dangerous. Not because they revealed information, but because they taught awareness. And awareness is incompatible with control. The modern world echoes the same patterns. Influence is exerted through screens, language, narratives, repetition. Not in the form of visible archons, but in algorithms, social frameworks, and thought trends. The symbols changed, but the mechanism remains. The artifice adapted, but the intention didn't. There is a language beneath language, code beneath form, a structure so subtle, yet so absolute, that it governs everything from the smallest particle to the vastness of perception itself. And for centuries, this code remained hidden beneath the assumptions of materialism. It wasn't until the frontiers of modern physics began to fracture under its own discoveries that a startling realization crept into view. The world is not built from objects, but from probabilities, relationships, and consciousness itself. This is not a poetic idea. It is a mathematical fact, and it has rewritten everything we thought we knew about what is real. The discovery of quantum mechanics did not merely add to our scientific understanding. It dismantled the old framework entirely. The world once believed to be solid, predictable, and mechanical was suddenly revealed as unstable, participatory, and deeply paradoxical. Particles do not simply exist in space. They exist in states of potential, waves of probability, until something observes them. The moment observation occurs, reality collapses into form. The wave becomes a particle. The probability becomes a fact. And with that observation, the most staggering implication arises. Consciousness is not separate from the fabric of reality. It is entangled with it. Not as a bystander, but as a participant. This discovery, known as the observer effect, has haunted physics ever since. Because it doesn't merely suggest that we influence reality. It implies that reality itself may require consciousness in order to exist in a specific form. This is not philosophical speculation. It is what the equations tell us. And those equations are not wrong. They are among the most precise models science has ever produced. But their implications stretch far beyond the lab. They stretch into the domain of perception, awareness, and the nature of being itself. To understand this shift, we must first step into the strangeness of the quantum world. In that domain, particles exist in superposition, multiple states at once. An electron doesn't have a precise location. It has a field of possibility, can be here or there or both until it is observed. And when it is observed, its position becomes definite, as if consciousness itself collapses the infinite into the particular. This isn't merely metaphorical. It is testable. It has been tested. And the results continue to astonish even the most rigorous minds. The famous double-slit experiment made this abundantly clear. When particles pass through two slits without being observed, they behave like waves, interfering with each other, creating a pattern of probability. But when observed, they behave like particles, choosing a specific path. It's as if reality is watching whether we are watching. And when we do, it changes. This single fact opens a new door. A door into a universe that is not constructed from matter, but from awareness. A universe where form follows perception. Where the structure of experience is not merely observed, it is shaped by the very act of observing. And yet, this idea was not new. It echoed the teachings of ancient systems, the same systems modern science once discarded. Those teachings spoke of a reality that responds to thought, a world shaped by consciousness, a cosmos that is mental in its foundation. Quantum mechanics didn't introduce a new idea. It rediscovered an ancient one, now wrapped in equations rather than symbols. But quantum mechanics didn't stop with observation. It revealed something even more disturbing: entanglement. When two particles become entangled, their states are linked, no matter how far apart they are. Change one and the other changes instantly, not through a signal, not through space, instantly, as if space is an illusion, as if everything is already connected beneath the visible layer. This phenomenon has been proven again and again. It violates classical understanding. It defies local causality. But it doesn't defy reality. It reveals its true nature. and that nature is not separateness. It is interconnection. The implications are staggering. If entanglement is not limited by space, then distance is not a fundamental property. If observation collapses probability, then consciousness is not a passive recorder, it is an active creator. And if matter emerges from probability fields, then the material world is not a fixed construct, it is a responsive interface. Now, consider what this means outside of physics. If consciousness shapes what appears, then the world you live in is not simply presented to you, it is assembled in response to you. Your beliefs, your attention, your emotional frequency, they don't just influence your mood. They influence the very architecture of your experience. This is the true meaning of the reality code. It is not a code written in letters or numbers, but in awareness. A code that responds not to effort, but to perception. And once that code is seen, the rules begin to shift. No longer is life a sequence of cause and effect dictated by external forces. It becomes a sequence of probability and response dictated by inner alignment. The question is no longer, what will happen to me? It becomes, what am I aligning myself with? Every emotion, every thought, every expectation is a form of alignment. Not in a mystical sense, but in a quantum sense. You tune into possibilities by the frequency of your perception, and reality responds accordingly, not as punishment or reward, but as resonance. This is why two people can experience the same event in completely different ways. Not because reality is subjective, but because it is layered. It responds to perception. It is not singular, it is multifaceted, multi-fielded, and modulated by awareness. And this brings us to one of the most radical theories ever proposed, the holographic universe theory. This theory suggests that the universe is not three-dimensional, but a projection from a two-dimensional field of information. In other words, what we see as form and depth is encoded in frequency and data, projected into perceptual experience. This idea finds support in quantum field theory, black hole thermodynamics, and even neuroscience. The brain, too, constructs experience holographically, assembling fragments of sensory data into coherent form. But what if the brain isn't just interpreting a hologram? It's participating in generating it. Then consciousness becomes not just a receiver of reality, but a transmitter. And the code isn't outside of you. It is running through you. This view dissolves the boundary between mind and matter. It renders the body as an interface, not a container. It reveals that your inner state is not a private affair. It is the tuning fork that shapes your reality field. This also explains why shifting inner patterns has such profound outer consequences. Why healing old beliefs changes current experience. Why intentions influence outcomes. Because the universe isn't reacting, it's responding. And it's responding to the code you emit. That code is not a set of affirmations. It is not a list of goals. It is the total signal of your being, your focus, your attention, your assumptions, your coherence. And every moment you are broadcasting that signal. The only question is, do you know what signal you're sending? This is the practical power hidden within quantum understanding. It moves beyond theory and becomes a tool, a way to reshape your relationship with reality, not by changing the external, but by reconfiguring your internal alignment. It is not a matter of belief. It is a matter of structure. Belief shapes structure. Structure shapes probability. Probability shapes experience. The code runs through you, but you choose how it is written. And once you realize that you no longer chase outcomes, you tune into them. You no longer force reality. You align with it. You no longer wait for change. You become the catalyst. This is not abstraction. It is mechanics, subtle, invisible, but exact. The more coherent your awareness becomes, the more synchronized your reality field becomes. Chaos reduces. Synchronicity increases. Clarity sharpens. Patterns accelerate. The code responds. Because it always has. You were never separate from it. You were just unaware of your place in it. But now the equation is changing. Now the signal is clearing. And now the code is being remembered not as a concept but as a lived resonance. Reality was never random. It was always responding. And now you've begun to speak its language. There is a strange pulse in the background of existence. A quiet distortion. A flicker in the rhythm that most ignore but some can feel. It arrives subtly. A memory that doesn't match history. A repeated event that defies logic. A pattern that slips through the cracks of probability. And while the world insists these are accidents, fragments, coincidences, the deeper mind begins to ask, what if these are not glitches in our perception, but evidence of glitches in the system itself? Reality is supposed to be consistent. That is the lie we were trained to believe. Linear time, stable cause and effect, immutable laws of physics. But there are moments where these rules fail, where the machine stutters, where something unknown peeks through the cracks of the so-called real. These anomalies are not random, they are signals. And they point toward something far more complex than the surface reality we've been taught to trust. For centuries, such anomalies were dismissed as hallucinations, myths, or flawed memory. But now, science itself is forced to confront the idea that reality might not be what it appears to be, not because of mysticism, but because the empirical evidence is breaking its own boundaries. One of the most unsettling signals comes from repeated quantum experiments that defy classical explanation. Beyond the double-slit experiment, there are deeper experiments, delayed choice, quantum erasure, quantum teleportation, that reveal a more disturbing truth. Reality is not fixed in the past. Observation now can change what has already happened. The implications are not philosophical, they are mathematical. And they suggest that time itself may be a projection, not a constant. Think about that carefully. If the act of observing a quantum system in the present can rewrite its past state, then the very fabric of linear time collapses. Past and future are not fixed positions on a line, they are entangled probabilities shaped by awareness. That means every moment you perceive is not simply a snapshot, it is a construction. And like any construction, it can glitch. These glitches are not confined to the quantum world. They are beginning to show up in our collective perception. Consider what many now refer to as the Mandela effect, a shared phenomenon where groups of people remember events, names, or historical details that no longer match the current records. These are not isolated cases. They are widespread, consistent, and remarkably specific. Thousands recall names, movie lines, brand logos, geography, even anatomy, differently than how they appear now. Yet no trace remains of the reality they remember. It's as if entire timelines have been rewritten while consciousness carries echoes from the version that came before. Skeptics argue it's faulty memory, mass confusion. But that explanation no longer fits the scope of the phenomenon. Why would so many minds across continents misremember the exact same details in the exact same way? Why would the anomalies cluster around specific categories, names, phrases, cultural artifacts? It's not random, it's patterned. And patterns mean something deeper is at play. Perhaps the most disturbing implication is this: if reality is constructed dynamically, and that construction is susceptible to interference, then anomalies could be evidence of system shifts, modifications in the underlying code. Just like a computer simulation displays visual errors when code is altered mid-run, reality may display perceptual glitches when the informational field that governs it is changed. This does not require us to assume a literal computer simulation. It only requires us to understand that reality behaves like an informational system, and systems by nature can be disrupted, altered, or recalibrated. There is a growing theory among physicists and philosophers alike that reality might be fundamentally digital, not in the sense of technology, but in the sense of quantized information units. In a digital universe, consciousness interacts with informational fields, not with physical matter. The atoms, photons, and neurons are not the source of experience. They are the visible output of deeper computational rules. In such a system, anomalies are not errors, they are traces of deeper processes. Sometimes those processes glitch. Sometimes they shift. Sometimes they accelerate. And when they do, perception flickers, memory shifts, synchronicities spike. And we are left wondering why reality suddenly feels less stable than before. The glitch phenomena go beyond memory anomalies. They show up in patterns of synchronicity, events that are too meaningful to be chance, but too improbable to be planned. They show up in lost time, hours or minutes unaccounted for with no logical cause. They show up in déjà vu, an inexplicable familiarity with a moment you've supposedly never lived before. These are not trivial curiosities. They are pressure points. They are signs that the system is not uniform. Pulses. It reacts, corrects, and in those moments, the truth reveals itself. Reality is adaptive, not static. It evolves in response to awareness, not independent of it. Some ancient systems understood this long before physics did. They spoke of Maya not merely as illusion but as dynamic flux, a shifting web of experience that conceals its own mechanisms. They taught that the world is a dream, not because it is false, but because it is mutable, shaped by consciousness rather than fixed substance. Modern anomalies are confirmations of this. They are not failures in our perception, they are fractures in the projection. When you feel the glitch, you are not losing your mind. You are gaining access. You are seeing the underlying malleability of the system. And once you recognize that, your relationship with experience changes forever. There is another category of anomaly few discuss openly: predictive distortions. Moments where reality seems to hint at events not yet unfolded. People report dreams, intuitions, symbolic patterns that later manifest in real-world events with uncanny precision. Some call it precognition. Others call it subconscious pattern recognition. But the mechanism remains unexplained. If reality is responsive to consciousness and consciousness is not bound by linear time, then glimpses into future states are not mystical. They are simply moments where awareness slips ahead of the current field. In a dynamic reality system, time is not a road, it's a field, and fields can be sensed before they are walked. These anomalies all point in one direction. The interface you call reality is not a passive screen. It is a living field, shaped by perception, fed by awareness, and occasionally disrupted by shifts in the underlying code. It is not failing, it is revealing. And the most dangerous illusion is not that the glitches exist. It's that they don't matter. But they do. Because every anomaly is an invitation. An invitation to stop accepting surface reality as final. An invitation to question the boundaries of what you call real. An invitation to begin seeing the architecture behind the experience. The moment you start paying attention to these distortions, something subtle changes. Patterns accelerate. Synchronicities increase. The fabric of experience becomes more fluid. And eventually, the veil begins to lift. Not in a dramatic flash, but in a quiet unraveling. This unraveling is not destructive, it's liberating. Because beneath the illusion of fixed reality is a deeper truth. You are not just perceiving the world. You are participating in its construction. And every anomaly is a crack in the wall that kept you from seeing that truth. The system is not broken, it's evolving. And it is offering you a choice. Continue believing in the stability of form, or begin decoding the patterns beneath it. One path leads to repetition. The other leads to awareness. And in that awareness, the code becomes visible. There is a belief so deeply embedded in the fabric of human experience that most never think to question it. It shapes every interaction, every conflict, every ambition, every identity. It is the belief in separation. The idea that you are here and everything else is out there. That consciousness exists inside a container, and everything beyond it is a separate object in a separate world. But this is not truth. It is programming. And that programming is the core illusion that sustains the boundaries of ordinary perception. For centuries, we've been trained to see life through a lens of fragmentation. Self versus other, subject versus object, mind versus matter. It's a worldview reinforced by language, by culture, by education, by sensory input. And yet, Every major advancement in both spiritual understanding and modern physics points to a single startling realization. Separation is not real. It is a perceptual artifact, not a fundamental truth. At the quantum level, the illusion begins to break. When physicists examine particles under extreme precision, they no longer behave like isolated units. Instead, they exhibit behaviors that suggest entanglement, a mysterious phenomenon in which particles, once connected, continue to affect each other instantaneously, regardless of distance. This is not metaphor. It is measurable. Entanglement shows that once a relationship is formed between two units of energy, they remain bonded beyond the limits of space and time. There is no signal passing through space. The effect is instantaneous. It breaks the logic of locality. It disrupts the foundation of classical physics. It implies that space is not a true separator. It is only a visual divider. Underneath, everything is still connected. And this doesn't just apply to particles. It applies to consciousness itself. Because if matter is entangled at the root level, then everything composed of matter, your body, your brain, your thoughts, is part of a non-local network of information. You are not an isolated node. You are a dynamic pattern within a unified field. This is where science begins to echo what mystics have said for millennia, that the mind is not inside the body. The body is inside the mind. That awareness does not emerge from the brain. The brain is an interface, not the source, and that the boundaries between beings are experiential, not existential. The concept of non-locality does not only challenge physics, it challenges identity. If your consciousness is not confined to a location, then your sense of self is no longer bound by skin, time, or name. You are not your thoughts. You are not your emotions. You are not your history. You are the field through which all these patterns flow. Unified field theories, advanced frameworks in physics that attempt to explain all forces and particles through a single underlying structure, are not just mathematical pursuits. They are spiritual declarations in disguise. Because at the heart of these theories lies a bold assertion. Everything that exists is a different expression of the same source energy. This source energy is not inert. It is intelligent, aware, responsive. It is the architecture of all forms, all events, all timelines. It flows through everything, yet belongs to no single thing. And it is accessible not just through theory but through perception. When you begin to observe reality from the lens of unity rather than separation, the world begins to transform. The artificial lines between self and other begin to dissolve. Every encounter becomes a mirror. Every challenge becomes a reflection. Every emotion becomes a signal from the field, not just an internal reaction. Even space itself reveals its illusory nature. Quantum experiments show that the position of a particle is not fixed until it is observed, which means where something is not a stable fact. It is a probability shaped by interaction. That which you call distance is not inherent. It is a perceptual agreement. And this has profound implications for the concept of consciousness transmission. If everything is part of a unified field, then intention, emotion, thought, these are not private phenomena. They are signals moving through the field. They influence, resonate, ripple through what we call reality. This is not mysticism. It is resonance physics. When ancient teachings said all is one, they were not speaking in metaphor. They were describing the structural nature of reality. Your body may appear separate from the tree, the sky, the stranger across the world, but your consciousness is already entangled with theirs. The field knows no boundaries. Only perception does. This illusion of separateness is the foundation of conflict. It is the root of fear, domination, exploitation, war. When beings believe they are isolated, they protect themselves through division. They compete instead of collaborate. They hoard instead of harmonize. They destroy what they perceive as external threats, unaware that the damage always loops back through the field. But when perception shifts, behavior transforms. When you begin to recognize that every thought you think sends vibration through the entire field, you begin to take responsibility not just for action, but for perception itself. You begin to refine the frequency of your mind, not for morality, but for coherence. Coherence is the key to influence in a unified reality. Coherence means your thought, emotion, and intention are aligned. It means your internal resonance is stable, not fragmented. In a unified field, coherence creates stronger ripple effects than chaos. Coherent beings shape reality more powerfully than reactive ones. This is why the most powerful shifts in reality often follow internal alignment, not external effort. You don't need to overpower the system, you need to tune into its harmonic language. And once you do, you stop reacting to life. You begin composing it. When you no longer see others as them, you start to feel their patterns within your own field. You become more sensitive to collective frequency. You begin to feel the distortions of thought forms around you, not because you are empathic in a sentimental way, but because you are becoming aware of the field's integrity. This is why ancient systems trained perception before power. They understood that without unity awareness, every tool becomes a weapon. Without perception of the whole, knowledge becomes manipulation. Power without unity leads to collapse, but power through unity becomes creation. And that is the turning point humanity stands on now. The growing awareness that everything is connected is not just spiritual awakening, it is evolutionary necessity. The systems built on separation are crumbling. The paradigms of division are reaching their entropy point. Because the field itself is shifting, and those who resist unity will increasingly find their realities destabilizing. But this is not punishment. It is recalibration. The field is not judging, it is harmonizing. And those who choose coherence, who choose unity, who choose to see through the illusion of separation, will not only experience a different world, they will shape it. You are not a fragment. You are a frequency. You are not a mind in a shell. You are a signal in the stream. And every moment you see through separation, you return to your original power, not as an individual but as a conscious node of the whole. And this shift is not philosophy. It is the next code in your awakening. There is a pattern hidden beneath the surface of history. A pulse, a rhythm, a cycle so ancient that modern eyes have forgotten how to see it. But those who came before us didn't forget. They mapped it. They encoded it in myth, in architecture, in rituals, in teachings passed through generations, not as superstition, but as a form of advanced awareness. The rise and fall of civilizations, the ascent and descent of collective consciousness, the evolution and devolution of awareness, none of it is random. It moves in cycles. Every culture that maintained deep spiritual knowledge knew this. From the Vedic sages to the Mayan astronomers, from the Egyptian priesthood to the Taoist scholars, there was an understanding that time is not a straight line. Time curves, time returns, time spirals through phases of awakening and forgetting. This wasn't merely symbolic. It was functional knowledge, because consciousness does not evolve in a linear path upward. It oscillates. Collective perception expands, contracts, expands again. Awareness peaks and falls. Entire societies rise into profound clarity, then descend into darkness and distortion. It's not a failure. It's a movement, and it's written into the framework of reality itself. When ancient texts speak of golden ages and dark ages, they are not simply romanticizing the past. They are pointing to phases of consciousness expression, periods where humans live in alignment with higher awareness, followed by phases where perception narrows and materialism, conflict, and forgetfulness dominate. This cyclic view of consciousness is mirrored in the concept of reincarnation, not merely as the return of individual souls, but as the return of awareness itself. Consciousness doesn't vanish. It reconfigures. It re-enters new forms. The soul is not just a static presence moving through lives. It is a vehicle of memory, a traveler across cycles, carrying fragments of wisdom through the tides of forgetting. But ancient warnings were clear. If these cycles are not remembered, individuals and societies risk falling deeper into unconscious patterns. The danger is not in death. The danger is in sleep. Sleep of the mind. Sleep of the spirit. A forgetting so complete that even the desire to awaken disappears. And that, more than anything, was what the wise ones feared most. Across various teachings, a concept appears repeatedly: soul entrapment. Not in the way popular culture interprets it, but in a far more subtle and insidious way. The soul, according to these traditions, can become ensnared in a loop of fragmented experiences, unable to break free from conditioned realities. Not by chains, but by resonance. Not by force, but by agreement. The soul forgets its origin. It begins to identify with the form, with the role, with the limitations imposed by each incarnation. And the more it aligns with the artificial constructs of the material world, the more difficult it becomes to reawaken. The trap is not physical, it is perceptual. The cage is built from belief. Some teachings refer to this as the wheel of samsara, an endless cycle of birth, suffering, death, and rebirth, driven by attachment and ignorance. Others call it the dream of Maya, a veil that distorts truth and keeps the soul locked in illusion. But in essence, they all describe the same mechanism: a loss of remembrance. And yet, those same traditions also carry techniques, not just philosophies but practical methods to escape the loop. Practices to maintain continuity of awareness across lives. Techniques for carrying conscious memory through transitions of death and birth. Rituals designed not for religion, but for remembrance. In Tibetan traditions, these methods were formalized in texts like the Book of the Dead, not as superstition, but as navigational guidance for the soul. In Egyptian teachings, elaborate rites were performed to guide the Ka, the subtle body, through realms beyond physical existence. In the Vedic systems, mantras were used to maintain vibrational coherence, even in altered states and death transitions. These were not primitive traditions. They were systems of consciousness science, forgotten not because they were irrelevant, but because the cycle moved downward and humanity entered a darker phase where material perception overrode subtle awareness. But the cycle is turning again. Right now, more people are experiencing spontaneous awakenings, altered perceptions, inexplicable memories, and energetic sensitivity. This is not coincidence. It is alignment. The pulse of consciousness is ascending again, moving into an upward spiral, where the forgotten codes begin to surface once more. But with this return comes responsibility. Because in every cycle of awakening, there is a threshold, a point where those who sense the shift must choose. Do they anchor the new frequency within themselves, or do they get pulled back into the comfort of programmed perception? Do they activate remembrance, or do they return to forgetting? This is why ancient teachings emphasize preparation, not just for the next life, but for each moment. Because the future is not just shaped by action. It is shaped by the state of your consciousness right now. The next life is seated in this one. The trajectory of perception is being written every day. That's why daily practices were considered sacred. Not for devotion, but for calibration. Breath work wasn't just about oxygen, it was about rhythm and awareness. Chanting wasn't just about words, it was about resonance and memory. Meditation wasn't about escape. It was about anchoring presence so deeply that even death couldn't erase it. And this is the key insight. Awareness, when cultivated consistently, becomes immune to distortion. It becomes a stable signal that carries through layers of form and transition. It becomes your map, your compass, your memory beyond memory. This is the true purpose of conscious practice, not to feel spiritual, but to remember your origin before it is overwritten again. To sharpen perception so precisely that the illusion no longer deceives. To tune your being to a frequency that remains coherent through every cycle. Because even though the system loops, you don't have to. Even though time curves, your awareness can remain steady. You can be the conscious signal in the spiral. The stable eye in the movement of time. The one who remembers while others forget. And the more you remember, the more access you have not just to your own latent potential, but to the knowledge encoded in the field itself. Memory is not just stored in your mind. It is stored in the field. Ancient knowledge is not lost. It's dormant, waiting for the right resonance to activate it. This is why certain symbols, sounds, or phrases can trigger a flood of insight. They are keys, codes that bypass the mind and speak directly to the deeper layers of awareness. They are the echoes of previous awakenings, still vibrating beneath the surface of this reality. The ancients didn't leave warnings because they were afraid. They left them because they knew we would forget, and they trusted that someone someday would begin to remember again, that someone would awaken not through chaos, but through quiet remembrance, that someone would break the loop, not with rebellion but with presence, and perhaps that someone is already listening. There's a structure beneath all things, a framework not built from atoms or energy, but from thought itself. At the deepest level of existence, everything obeys principles that transcend physical laws. These principles are not speculative. They are the roots from which reality itself unfolds. Ancient mystics called this understanding the foundation of all knowledge, a system that isn't learned, but remembered, because it lives within the architecture of consciousness itself. The ancients knew that the universe is not just matter in motion. They saw it as mind in manifestation. They didn't mean thought in the casual sense of ideas or opinions. They meant something far more profound, conscious intention structured into form. Reality, in this view, is not built from objects but from archetypes, not from particles but from principles. And those principles govern everything from the smallest action to the largest galactic cycle. This idea was not born in temples or laboratories. It was remembered in silence, refined in solitude, passed through initiatory systems designed not to teach, but to awaken what was already known, buried beneath the surface of awareness. These teachings, often hidden in symbolic language, formed a bridge between mind and matter, between inner experience and external reality. One of the most powerful ideas that emerged from this understanding is the concept that all is mind, that the universe itself is a mental construct, not metaphorically but structurally, that every element of experience, every shape, event, and phenomenon is a projection of consciousness operating within a structured field of awareness. When one understands this, perception begins to shift. Events are no longer random. Circumstances are not accidents. Encounters are not coincidences. Everything becomes a reflection of the inner state, expressed through external symbols. Every reaction, every challenge, every breakthrough, each is part of a larger symphony being conducted by the vibrational pattern of your mind. This idea is often misunderstood because modern culture has reduced mind to brain activity. But what the ancients referred to as mind was not limited to the skull. It was the substrate of existence, a boundless field of intelligence from which all form arises. The individual mind, then, is not an isolated processor, it is a frequency node in a much larger continuum. This is why thoughts influence matter, not because of superstition, but because thought is the blueprint. It is the code written before the structure appears. This isn't positive thinking or wishful belief, it's structural alignment. When thought coheres with higher-order patterns, it activates resonance. That resonance informs form, and form follows it like a shadow follows motion. Another core principle within this system is correspondence. The idea that what happens on one level of reality mirrors what occurs on another. That patterns repeat across all scales, macrocosm and microcosm reflecting each other in precise symmetry. This principle isn't poetic, it's mechanical. It's a way of reading the universe like a language. You can look at a molecule and understand a galaxy. You can study your own emotional state and discern the movement of a civilization. You can observe your environment and detect what's happening in your internal world. The outer world doesn't just reflect the inner, it is shaped by it, sculpted by invisible geometries of thought and energy. This is why self-mastery was considered the highest form of power. Not dominance over others, but precision within the self. Because when one tunes their internal vibration with accuracy, the external reality must respond. It has no choice, it is downstream from consciousness. This is not mysticism. It is cause and effect at a higher order of mechanics. The ancients mapped these principles not through abstract theory, but through direct perception. They trained their minds like instruments, fine-tuned to detect the hidden structure beneath reality. They weren't worshipping gods. They were working with laws. Laws that, once seen, can no longer be unseen. Laws that, once applied, begin to shift reality in measurable ways. They taught that polarity governs movement, that every phenomenon exists on a spectrum, from hot to cold, from love to fear, from light to darkness, and that mastering polarity means knowing how to move energy across those spectrums intentionally, rather than being thrown around by unconscious reactions. They understood rhythm not as music but as temporal balance, the rise and fall of energy, the swing of cycles, the pulse of events. Every situation, emotion, or crisis exists within a rhythm. And when you recognize the rhythm, you no longer get caught in its wave. You ride it, adjust to it, and even redirect it when necessary. They taught about cause and effect, not in the basic sense of action and consequence, but in the deeper sense that nothing escapes law, that there is no such thing as randomness, that behind every experience is a pattern, and behind every pattern is a principle, and behind every principle is a decision of consciousness. Perhaps most transformative was the understanding of gender, not as human roles but as universal polarity. Masculine and feminine principles existing in all things, not just people. One representing active projection, the other receptive formation. Creation itself is the interaction between these forces, both within individuals and within reality as a whole. These ideas were not meant to be worshipped, they were meant to be applied. Because once you see life as governed by principles rather than chance, you gain access to a new kind of power. Not domination over the external, but mastery of perception. The power to shift your experience not by changing the world, but by changing how you interface with it. Everything begins in the mind. Every habit, every breakthrough, every pattern, every destiny. The outer world cannot exceed the inner structure. When the mind is fragmented, reality reflects fragmentation. When the mind is ordered, reality responds with clarity. This is not philosophy. It's physics on a higher octave. Modern science is just beginning to approach these concepts again. The discovery that observation alters quantum behavior. The realization that thought impacts biological processes. The studies showing that intention affects water structure, plant growth, electromagnetic fields. But these are fragments of a larger picture, one that was already mapped by ancient consciousness systems long ago. And yet, even now, these laws are often dismissed. Not because they are untrue, but because they cannot be measured in the traditional sense. They must be lived. They must be tested internally. Their evidence is not found in laboratories, it is found in experience. In the subtle shift that happens when you align your thought with the underlying architecture of reality. This is why consciousness training was once considered sacred. Because once the mind is focused, reality sharpens. Once intention is coherent, reality organizes. Once perception is precise, reality becomes a canvas that reflects your deepest alignment. That's the secret most never realize. The world doesn't change first. You do. And when you do, the world has no option but to reflect that change. You are not reacting to reality, you are participating in its structure. These teachings are not lost. They are encoded in symbols, metaphors, allegories, waiting to be decoded not with intellect, but with awareness. They were never meant to be memorized. They were meant to be activated. And once activated, they don't just inform you, they transform you. Because when you begin to understand that everything is mental, you begin to take responsibility for the frequencies you carry. the thoughts you hold, the meanings you assign. You begin to see that every reaction is a choice, every belief is a design, and every experience is a mirror of your internal state. This isn't about controlling reality. It's about aligning with the laws that shape it. When you do, you don't need to force change, it flows through you. When you do, you don't seek power, you express it naturally. And when you do, you realize you were never separate from the universe at all. You were always a part of its mind. Everything in existence vibrates. Nothing is ever truly still. At the deepest level of what we call matter, motion is constant, frequency is law, and resonance is the hidden key. This is not poetry, this is physics. Every atom, every molecule, every cell pulses with a signature rhythm. It is this rhythm, this oscillation of energy, that forms the scaffolding of all physical reality. And whether one knows it or not, every thought, emotion, and state of being operates within this vibrational field, influencing what is drawn into one's life, moment by moment. Resonance is not just a mechanical phenomenon, it is a universal principle. When two objects vibrate at the same frequency, they begin to exchange energy more efficiently. They start to move in harmony. This is why a singer can shatter a glass with their voice, not because of loudness, but because of match. When frequency aligns, power multiplies. Now consider what this means on a more subtle level. Every human being emits a field. This field is measurable. Bioelectrical impulses from the heart and brain radiate outward in waves. But these waves are not merely static, they are shaped by inner states. A thought is not confined to the brain. It produces an energetic echo. A mood is not just internal, it projects a signature. This projection interacts with the surrounding field, affecting both people and matter in ways modern science is only beginning to uncover. Intent is frequency. It is not just a psychological state, it is a vibrational command. When an intention is held with clarity and emotional coherence, it becomes a tuning fork. It begins to attract circumstances, ideas, and synchronicities that match its frequency. This is not supernatural, it is electromagnetic. The brain, the heart, and the nervous system act like transmitters and receivers. And like all receivers, they are sensitive to what they're tuned to. When someone is caught in negative thinking, unresolved emotion, or inner chaos, their vibrational field becomes disordered. Their frequency drops. And the lower the frequency, the more chaotic the pattern. This isn't a judgment, it's a law. Lower frequency patterns tend to attract more dissonance, confusion, and repetition of unwanted loops. Not because life is punishing, but because frequency is pattern, and pattern attracts its own reflection. Now reverse the process. When the inner environment is harmonized, when the mind becomes still, emotions balanced, and intent focused, frequency rises. The field becomes coherent, and coherent fields influence incoherent ones. This is why one centered individual can shift the energy of an entire room. It's not charisma, it's vibration dominance. Research into heart coherence has shown that the electromagnetic field produced by the heart is not only larger than that of the brain, but also plays a central role in emotional regulation and interpersonal resonance. The more harmonious the heart rhythm, the more balanced the emotional state, and the more powerful the transmission of influence. In simpler terms, when the heart and brain work in sync, the human system becomes a beacon of stabilized frequency. This is the deeper meaning behind phrases like, raise your vibration. It's not about being artificially positive. It's about becoming structurally coherent, mentally, emotionally, energetically. Because coherence is power, clarifies intention, it amplifies signal, it aligns inner frequency with higher order patterns of intelligence. And it's not limited to theory. Experiments have shown that focused intention can influence physical systems. Groups meditating together have altered crime rates. Plants have responded to human attention. Random number generators have shifted statistically during collective emotional events. These phenomena are not anomalies. They are windows into how consciousness interacts with matter through frequency. Sound is one of the most direct ways to access this principle. Sound is structured vibration. It has pattern, rhythm, form. And when sound is used consciously, it can retune biological systems. Certain frequencies reduce stress. Others induce altered states. Some even trigger spontaneous releases of trauma held in cellular memory. Sound bypasses intellectual defense mechanisms and speaks directly to the body's internal architecture. That's why ancient cultures always used sound in their sacred practices. Mantras, chants, tones, they weren't symbolic. They were vibrational keys, designed to open specific energetic centers and recalibrate the system. Modern science now confirms that sound frequencies can influence brainwaves, immune responses, and even DNA expression. Similarly, light is frequency. Color is not a pigment. It is vibration perceived through the lens of the senses. Each color carries a specific energetic signature. This is why environments painted in particular hues produce distinct psychological effects. It's not placebo, it's photonic resonance interacting with biofields. Even thought has frequency. Every word you speak, every image you hold in your mind, generates an electromagnetic imprint, and the repetition of thought solidifies frequency patterns in the brain. This is why habitual thinking becomes character, why chronic emotional states become biology. The mind and body are not separate. They are interwoven systems of vibration that reflect and amplify each other. So how does one shift their resonance intentionally? It starts with awareness, becoming conscious of your internal frequency, not in vague emotional terms, but in precise energetic terms. What kind of thoughts dominate your field? What emotions are you sustaining? What's the energetic texture of your daily environment? Most people operate on autopilot, unaware that their internal frequency is generating a feedback loop that shapes their life experience. Second is alignment. This means choosing thoughts, actions, and emotions that synchronize with higher patterns, not out of moral obligation but vibrational precision. Gratitude, compassion, clarity. These are not just virtues. They are high-frequency states that tune your system into resonance with a higher intelligence. Third is purification, not in a religious sense but energetically, removing distortion from the field, releasing unresolved emotional residue, clearing subconscious loops. The more distortion you carry, the more scattered your signal becomes. Purification is about signal clarity, removing the noise so your intention can be heard by the universe without interference. Fourth is embodiment. Holding the frequency consistently, not just thinking it during meditation, but living it. Your walk, your speech, your presence, all become carriers of your internal vibration. The more you live in alignment, the stronger your resonance becomes, and the less you need to force outcomes. Resonance draws them in organically. There are also specific techniques that can amplify resonance. Breath control. Conscious breathing synchronizes heart and brain waves, creating internal coherence. Sound entrainment, listening to binaural beats, solfeggio frequencies, or harmonic instruments can tune your nervous system. Visualization, holding specific imagery with emotional charge, imprints a vibrational pattern into your field. Movement, practices like Tai Chi or Qigong circulate energy and refine your internal frequency. Silence. Stillness is a resonant field of its own. It clears distortion and allows higher frequencies to integrate. The key is consistency. Resonance is cumulative. The more you align your system with coherent vibration, the more effortlessly reality conforms to it. This isn't magic. It's mechanics. You're not bending reality, you're aligning with its original language, frequency. And the more refined your resonance becomes, the more sensitive you become to the hidden codes behind experience. You start noticing patterns others miss. You detect the emotional frequency of words, rooms, people. You begin to influence not through persuasion, but presence. not through argument but coherence. Your very being becomes an instrument that shapes the reality around you. Because in the end, everything is frequency. Thought is frequency. Emotion is frequency. Experience is the echo of frequency. You're not just a body walking through space. You're a tuning instrument moving through fields of vibration. And the more consciously you tune yourself, the more precisely you shape your experience. There's a point in the journey where information is no longer enough. A moment when concepts, philosophies, and theories must give way to something far more personal, direct awareness. The kind that cuts through layers of illusion not with complexity, but with clarity. Because no matter how much you learn, how many insights you collect, or how deep your understanding becomes, nothing compares to the power of clear awareness applied consistently in your everyday existence. Awareness is not passive. It is not simply being mentally awake or intellectually alert. It's an active force, a conscious presence that begins to dissolve everything artificial the moment it's truly engaged. Awareness does not argue with illusions, it exposes them. It does not wrestle with conditioning, it reveals the strings behind the puppet show. And in that exposure, something profound occurs. The entire structure that once held your reality together begins to shift. Not through effort, through observation. Every conditioned pattern, every programmed belief, every reaction that has defined your experience up until now, none of it can survive sustained awareness. Because awareness brings light to what has remained hidden. It reveals the subconscious scripts, the emotional loops, the behavioral mimicry that runs unnoticed. It doesn't attack these patterns. It simply illuminates them, and in that light, their grip weakens. This is why ancient traditions didn't emphasize information accumulation as much as they emphasized internal clarity. Not because knowledge is unimportant, but because clarity is transformation. Awareness doesn't just notice thoughts, it watches them without identification. It doesn't just acknowledge emotions, it tracks them without collapsing into them. It observes behavior without justification. It sees the mask and the face beneath it. And the more you watch, the more everything false begins to unravel on its own. You begin to realize how many of your decisions were driven by unconscious scripts. How many of your emotions were inherited echoes rather than original responses. How much of your internal dialogue was never really yours to begin with. Awareness makes this visible. And once seen, it can no longer control you in the same way. There's an illusion many carry, that change requires effort, struggle, discipline. But real change begins with attention. Not forced, not dramatic, but consistent attention. Try this. Bring full awareness to your daily habits. Not to change them, just to watch them. The way you speak, the way you react, the tone in your voice when you're impatient, the posture you unconsciously hold. The moment you become the observer of these small movements, you initiate a silent revolution within. Because what you observe, you reclaim. And what you reclaim, you can choose. Awareness restores choice where reaction once ruled. It reintroduces freedom where conditioning held sway. You're no longer just a pattern reacting to stimuli. You become a presence choosing reality moment by moment. This is liberation not as an abstract ideal but as a lived experience. Liberation is not escape. It's not transcendence in some far-off spiritual realm. It's the shedding of unconscious weight. It's waking up inside your own life, not trying to leave it. It's the realization that the chains weren't forged by the external world. They were woven by unnoticed thoughts, unquestioned beliefs, unseen identifications. This is where the practical power of awareness becomes evident. Every moment becomes an opportunity to choose presence over programming. Every interaction becomes a mirror. Every trigger becomes a teacher. Every irritation becomes a message. Not because the world changed, but because your lens did. And the beauty is, this clarity isn't reserved for special moments or meditation cushions. It lives in the mundane. Washing dishes becomes meditation. Walking becomes observation. Listening becomes communion. Speaking becomes a conscious act. The ordinary becomes sacred because you are present within it. Awareness is the alchemy that turns routine into realization. But this isn't about being hypervigilant or detached. True awareness is relaxed. It's not analytical, it's perceptive. It doesn't chase thoughts. It watches them arise and dissolve. It doesn't resist emotion. It follows its movement, sees its source, and allows its release. There's no tension in true awareness, only openness. The more you practice, the more effortless it becomes. Like tuning an instrument, you begin to feel when you're in clarity and when you're out of tune. Eventually, awareness becomes your baseline. And from that baseline, you begin to access dimensions of yourself you never knew existed. Intuition becomes clearer. Creativity becomes effortless. Decisions become precise. Because awareness is also alignment. The more coherent your awareness, the more aligned you become with your deeper intelligence. Not the noise of the mind, but the clarity of inner knowing. In this state, life begins to feel different. Not because events change, but because perception changes. You start seeing the hidden patterns in conversations. You notice the energetic quality behind words. You sense when someone's behavior is a mask and when it's real. You detect subtle shifts in your own emotional field. And because you see clearly, you respond clearly. Your actions become accurate. Your words carry weight. Your silence becomes powerful. It's important to understand that awareness is not about perfection. You will still feel emotion. You will still make mistakes. You will still be human. But now you're conscious in the process. You're no longer stuck in reactive cycles. You catch yourself faster. You course correct sooner. And with time, even your mistakes become lessons rather than burdens. And then something extraordinary begins to unfold. Your relationship with reality itself begins to transform. You start seeing how reality responds to awareness. How synchronicities appear more frequently. How insights arrive when you're still. How clarity opens doors that effort could never reach. This isn't metaphysical, it's mechanical. Awareness sharpens your signal, and life responds accordingly. Daily practices can help refine this clarity, not through force, but through intentional presence. Morning stillness. Begin each day with 5 minutes of silent awareness before reaching for the world. Awareness journaling. Write without agenda, just observing your inner landscape without judgment. Conscious listening. Practice hearing others without waiting to speak. Let their energy register fully. Observation breaks. Pause throughout the day to simply feel your body, notice your breath, and track your current state. Thought tracking. At any moment, ask yourself, what am I thinking? And who is thinking it? These aren't rituals. They're recalibrations. Micro-adjustments that bring your awareness back into focus again and again. The goal isn't to become a monk. The goal is to live as a conscious human being in a world that runs on automation. To become a quiet force of clarity amidst a fog of distraction. Because awareness isn't just about personal growth. It's about energetic hygiene. When you operate unconsciously, you leak energy. You absorb noise. You react to shadows. But when you hold awareness, your field becomes sealed. Your energy becomes focused. Your presence becomes felt. And you begin to live not as a fragmented mind, but as a unified intelligence. The path isn't to escape reality. It's to see it clearly. And when seen clearly, reality becomes a different thing altogether. It ceases to be a prison and becomes a mirror. It stops being a maze and becomes a message. It stops being random and becomes responsive. Liberation doesn't happen in the future. It happens now. Not through struggle, but through sight. And the more you choose awareness, the more freedom you generate, not as a reward, but as a natural consequence of clarity. You are not your thoughts. You are not your reactions. You are not the voice in your head that tells you who you are. You are the one who is aware of it all. And once you know this, not as theory but as reality, you begin to remember what was never really lost. Your true power. Your original state. Your unbroken awareness. At some point, The journey stops being about information and begins to confront a more intimate truth, one that few are willing to fully accept. You are not just a participant in reality. You are its active sculptor. You are not merely perceiving the world. You are shaping it with every thought you hold, every belief you sustain, every emotion you feed, and every word you speak. This is not metaphor. It is not poetic abstraction. It is one of the most fundamental mechanics of existence. Your perception generates your experience. Most people have been conditioned to think reality is something happening to them, something outside their control, something imposed by forces larger than them. But what if this assumption is the single most binding illusion of all? What if this belief is the veil that keeps you trapped in cycles you unconsciously feed? The truth is much simpler. Every time you interpret an event, you give it meaning. And that meaning then feeds your next thought, your next emotional state, and your next decision. This sequence doesn't just shape your internal state, it reshapes your external experience over time. This is how reality loops are formed. A belief fuels perception. That perception creates interpretation. That interpretation generates response. That response confirms the original belief. And on it goes. Until one day you ask, why does life feel like it keeps repeating itself? The answer is simple. You are looping through your own filters. Not because you want to, but because you haven't questioned them. But the moment you do, something extraordinary begins to happen. That loop weakens. That filter cracks. And space opens up. Space for a new signal. A new reality. Not a fantasy. Not a wish. A new construction based on conscious intention rather than unconscious repetition. This is the unspoken choice that sits beneath every experience. You can reinforce what's been programmed into you, or you can begin crafting what resonates with your deeper clarity. Not from ego, not from escapism, but from responsibility. Not the kind of responsibility society burdens you with. The kind that liberates you. The responsibility of knowing you are a co-creator, not a captive. And this is not about pretending everything is perfect or denying challenge. It's about recognizing your role in how you process, translate, and respond to reality. A difficulty arises, will you assign it meaning based on old fear scripts? Or will you see it as a prompt for new evolution? Someone insults you, do you immediately defend the identity you've been clinging to? Or do you pause and witness what part of you still reacts to external definition? You miss an opportunity. Do you spiral into guilt and scarcity? Or do you use the moment to sharpen your focus and refine your frequency? This is where creation begins, not in the outer world, but in your inner interpretation. It's not about trying to control every external condition. It's about mastering the lens you use to experience them. That lens becomes your tuning fork. And the more precise your inner tuning, the more coherent your outer experiences become. But here's the part most overlook, your unconscious still creates. Even when you're unaware of it. Even when you're distracted. Even when you're mentally asleep. The only difference is, in those states, you're not directing the creation. You're leaking it. You're producing reality based on inherited programs, emotional reactivity, and societal scripts. The machine is still running. You're just not sitting at the control panel. To reclaim that seat, you must ask the questions most never dare to ask. What beliefs am I still carrying that don't belong to me? What assumptions am I still validating that keep me small? What stories am I still telling myself that make mediocrity feel safe? What invisible contracts am I still honoring that were never written by my own clarity? These questions are not rhetorical. They're gateways. And the more honestly you answer them, the more you reclaim authorship over your own life. Because this is not about creating a fantasy life. It's about living with precision, direction, and conscious authorship. Here's the paradox. Most people are not afraid of suffering. They're afraid of power. Because power brings responsibility. Power eliminates excuses. Power demands presence. When you realize that your reality responds to you, not just in small ways but in structure and form, you can no longer hide behind disempowered narratives. You are either creating from clarity or you're recreating from programming. So the real question becomes, what signal are you broadcasting right now? Not the one you wish you were broadcasting. The actual one, the thoughts you circulate most often, the emotions you repeat most frequently, the energy you project unconsciously. That's the signal that shapes your field. That's the architecture behind your personal reality. And there's no mystery to changing it. The same way you built the old signal through repetition, you can build a new one. Through consistent conscious input. Not through force, but through clarity. You begin aligning your thoughts with the reality you wish to experience. You begin regulating your emotional responses to match the frequency of your desired state. You begin choosing your words like precision instruments. You begin acting not from reaction, but from alignment. This is not positive thinking. It's energetic architecture. You're not just trying to feel good. You're creating structural coherence between your mind, your emotion, your intention, and your behavior. That coherence is what generates resonance. And resonance is what makes reality shift. You've already seen this in your life, whether you've noticed or not. Think back to times when everything felt in sync. When events lined up perfectly. When clarity seemed to magnetize opportunity. That wasn't luck. That was coherence. That was internal alignment reflected in external form. The only difference now is that you're becoming conscious of it, and therefore intentional with it. The real power lies in consistency, not dramatic shifts, not spiritual highs, but quiet, repeated clarity. You don't need a new technique every week. You need sustained intention every day. Reality bends to the signal you stabilize, not the one you occasionally flirt with. And the beauty of this is, it's always in your hands. Always. And that's the hidden key most people never turn. Your life is not a reaction to the world. The world is a reflection of your signal. Your thoughts are not isolated, they are generative. Your emotional states are not private, they are architectural. Your beliefs are not passive, they are commands to the fabric of experience. So ask yourself honestly, what reality have you been ordering from the field, simply by the beliefs you've maintained, the emotions you've rehearsed, and the narratives you've fed? And more importantly, what are you ready to change now that you know? Because nothing outside of you is as powerful as what you hold within. The systems, the structures, the social patterns, they don't have power over your signal unless you unconsciously match their frequency. The moment you stop feeding that alignment, the moment you recalibrate your internal state, the external begins to reflect a new architecture. Subtle at first, then obvious, then undeniable. And this is the invitation you've always had access to stop being a passive participant in a reality shaped by unconscious codes. To begin crafting experience with full authorship. Not through fantasy, through intentional awareness, through conscious selection, through energetic precision. The choice is not in some distant future. It's in the moment you decide to stabilize a new signal, regardless of the old one still echoing. It's in the moment you say, this thought doesn't serve me anymore. This emotional habit no longer defines me. This story is expired. And this belief is no longer mine to carry. That's how a new reality is born. Not in the sky, but in the stillness of your own alignment. The deeper you look into reality, the more the illusion of limitation begins to collapse. You've now walked through a journey that questions everything you've been taught to accept without hesitation. Your senses, your beliefs, your identity, your world. And what stands on the other side is not confusion, but power. Not fantasy, but clarity. Not mysticism for mysticism's sake, but a framework for experiencing life through conscious awareness instead of passive conditioning. This isn't about adopting a new set of beliefs. It's about shedding the ones you didn't even know you had. It's about no longer accepting reality at face value, because face value was never the full story. Behind every event, every thought, every perception, there are codes, patterns that determine what becomes real for you and what remains hidden. You've been exposed to some of those codes in this guide. The illusion of sensory dominance, the manipulations of unseen thought structures, the mysteries of quantum fields, the forgotten wisdom of ancient teachings, and the bridge that modern science is slowly beginning to build toward truths that were once only whispered in shadows. The veil isn't something that needs to be torn down. It's something that thins the moment your awareness sharpens. Every time you question a belief, the veil weakens. Every time you notice your own programming, the veil flickers. Every time you take full authorship of your internal state, the veil fades, until eventually what seemed like a wall becomes a transparent lens, and you begin to see through it rather than being bound by it. But the real transformation begins when knowledge turns into application, when theory becomes lived frequency. This entire journey only becomes meaningful if it's embodied, not just understood, but practiced. That's where your reality begins to shift in tangible, undeniable ways. So here's the practical guidance to carry forward. Begin by refining your internal language. Every word you speak silently or aloud is a command to your reality architecture. Observe it, cleanse it, replace reactive phrases with intentional ones. Let precision replace habit. Next, develop emotional resonance awareness. Don't suppress feelings, study them. What emotions do you rehearse most? What energetic tones dominate your day? Trace them to the thought patterns that produce them, and then rewire those thought structures consciously, repeatedly, until they align with your intended signal. Start reprogramming your attention. What you consistently focus on becomes your experiential truth. Attention is not passive, it's a tool of construction. Choose where it rests. Choose what it energizes. Choose what you amplify. Adopt conscious rituals. You don't need complexity, only consistency. Whether it's early morning silence, intention setting, mindful movement, or breath recalibration, repetition of awareness builds the internal structures that rewire your perception field. Ritual anchors consciousness in motion. Challenge every inherited belief, especially the ones that feel most comfortable. Comfort is often a mask for unconscious agreement. Start keeping a journal not of your goals, but of your assumptions. Interrogate those assumptions until only clarity remains. Develop sensory decoupling. Begin noticing when your senses lead you into unconscious interpretation. Pause. Decode. Shift perspective before response. This builds internal sovereignty one micromoment at a time. Align behavior with energy. Action is not separate from consciousness. Every behavior either reinforces coherence or disrupts it. Begin choosing action from clarity rather than habit. Let behavior become an extension of your frequency, not a reaction to your environment. Master energetic hygiene. You are constantly exchanging signals with your environment. Clean your field. Clean your inputs. Clean your inner dialogue. Frequency management is not mystical, it's hygiene for consciousness. Develop frequency literacy. Learn to feel the tone behind people, ideas, media, and environments. Not just their surface message, but their vibration. This skill alone will protect you from manipulation and dissonance more than any amount of external information ever could. And most importantly, stay grounded in inquiry. Not certainty. Not dogma. Inquiry. The most awakened minds remain students forever, not because they lack answers, but because their answers never stop evolving. Stay curious, not skeptical. Stay alert, not paranoid. Stay discerning, not dismissive. To aid your continued expansion, consider immersing yourself in the following resources, not as doctrines, but as frequency stimulants. They are not here to provide conclusions, but to activate your own inner codex of understanding. Study quantum theory fundamentals, not just the science, but the implications for your own consciousness field. Explore works by David Bohm, Amit Goswami, and Carlo Rovelli. Explore metaphysical texts that bridge ancient wisdom and modern resonance. Hermetic philosophy, Taoist alchemy, Sankhya cosmology, and Gnostic commentaries offer keys hidden in symbolic language. Approach them not literally, but energetically. Revisit philosophy through a new lens, not to debate theories, but to extract the embedded codes in their observations. Look into the writings of Arthur Schopenhauer, Baruch Spinoza, and even Friedrich Nietzsche, not for their critique of systems but their insight into perceptual sovereignty. Use vibrational practices that reattune your nervous system. Sound-based recalibration such as solfeggio frequencies, harmonic chanting, or binaural patterns can stimulate subconscious rewiring. Approach them as tools, not crutches. Practice language deconstruction. Study linguistic relativity, the idea that the language you use shapes what you can perceive. Begin editing your language to match the consciousness you wish to live in. Engage in symbolic pattern recognition. Study mythology, archetypes, and dream symbolism, not for surface narratives, but for their recurring energetic signatures. This will sharpen your pattern intelligence in both inner and outer perception. Keep a frequency journal. Track your dominant thoughts, emotional tones, and internal dialogues across days. Begin noticing patterns not through analysis, but through energetic feeling. Where does your signal fluctuate? Where does it stabilize? Join consciousness research forums and groups, not for social engagement but for thought expansion. Let new insights challenge your internal frameworks. But hold your sovereignty firm. All these are tools, not replacements for your own clarity, but refiners of it. You are your own calibration system. You are the tuning fork, the receiver, and the transmitter. And the more you align your frequency, the more the architecture of your reality shifts to reflect it. Not by force, but by resonance. And now, as this guide concludes, the real journey begins, because nothing outside of you holds more transformative power than the signal you choose to maintain within. This is your invitation to live as a signal carrier of conscious creation. To leave behind the echo of programmed thought. To stop reacting and start radiating. To walk not in default perception, but intentional design. This is not theory. This is architecture. Your thoughts are blueprints. Your emotions are magnetic fields. Your beliefs are energetic scaffolding. And your awareness is the builder. So choose. Not someday. Now. Not hypothetically. Practically. Not in crisis. In clarity. Your reality is not a sentence. It's a canvas. You are not a product of systems. You are the coder of experience. And everything begins the moment you stop consuming reality and start constructing it. Would you like me to now summarize the entire video with a short YouTube description, quote, tags, and thumbnail ideas?